So we'll begin with brief presentations by each panelist. After the presentations, our panel discussant, Gordon Lafer, will use prepared questions to lead a discussion with the panelists. While this is going on, we'll ask audience members to post their questions in the online session chat, and then I'll pull questions from the online chat for the remainder of the discussion. And so, I'll turn it over to Eunice now.
I'm muted. I'm unmuted now. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me. So this paper is co-authored with Dr. Kiff, and as the title says, we're trying to learn what teachers' unions do for teachers when the collective bargaining is not an option for them. So, some background. We know there are a lot of states allow collective bargaining, and it actually, some of them have mandatory collective bargaining laws. So most studies on unions focus on those states, and they kind of assume that the collective bargaining is the key and then the essence of union activities. But we actually know that in a lot of other states that ban collective bargaining, many school teachers also unionize, but we know very little about what teachers unions can do in those states. So in our study, we focused on 8 states that do not have collective bargaining laws for public school teachers. And this is actually a follow-up study to our previous paper that's been published in the Educational Policy in early January this year. And in that paper, we find the significant correlation between students' test score and teachers' union strengths in these states that ban collective bargaining. So we're trying to investigate the potential mechanisms through which unions influence any kind of factors that's associated with educational outcome. And here we're trying to investigate where teachers' unions may influence teacher outcome. So straightforward research questions. Why do teachers even join the unions when collective bargaining is not an option? And in the absence of collective bargaining, do teachers' union influence these elements? For instance, teacher compensation, employment conditions, and teacher turnover, both attrition and dismissal, so that the teachers' union ultimately may affect teachers' quality. And how do we measure union strengths when collective bargaining is not available? We have 2 different measures. One is teacher union membership rate, which we can call union density in each district. The other one is meet and confer process. I mean, meet and confer is not the same thing as a collective bargaining. It's not legally enforceable, but through meet and confer, union representative and their management, they meet and discuss, and they can talk about terms and conditions of the employment. And if it's repeated, then we believe that some of the discussions done in the meet and confer can carry it over and actually be implemented. So using those 2 measures, we conduct the empirical analysis, and these are our main findings. So as we all expected, actually, no, we actually did not expect this to see. Unions do increase teacher compensation. Unions do promote employment condition and improve the conditions. And teacher attrition has also been impacted by teachers' unions. So you have lower teacher attrition rate, but surprisingly, we have higher dismissal rate of teachers in this state. So the strong union districts dismiss more bad teachers over the probationary period. So having said this, and because we found this interesting patterns, we realized that, oh, this might be a reason why teachers want to unionize, because teachers still do get higher pay from the unionization, and their employment condition is improving by smaller class size, and they have shorter school days, and their control in the classroom is greater. So these are the main factors we found that could be a factor that teachers unionizing, even though they don't have collective bargaining rights. And because teachers are enjoying these benefits from the union activity, attrition rate is lower. And teacher dismissal is a little separate topic, so I'm hoping that I will be able to address this more if the follow-up question is related to this one. Basically, this is from the employer's response. If teachers unions demanding more of the good stuff, employer has to respond to that by doing some sort of trade-off. And what we believe is that employer will have to do some of the bad stuff to compensate for the good stuff they have to do for the unions. Thank you.
Okay, and when I was scrambling to make sure that I was recording, I had a moment of panic. I forgot to ask everybody to introduce themselves. So Eunice, would you please introduce yourself, and then we'll go to our next presenter.
Okay, my name is Eunice. I'm an assistant professor of the University of Utah in economics department. I've been in the school for 4 years. My specialty is on the labor unions and focus mostly on public sector unions because that's where the unions have its strengths still. So I look at mostly educational outcome, teacher outcome, and what's happening in the teachers' labor market. But eventually I'm expanding this whole logic to the unions and labor market in general. So income inequality, worker mobility, intergenerational mobility, those are the main topics that I've been discussing with my papers.
Okay, thank you. And can we stop the screen share? Great, thank you. And so next up we have Roland Zullo, and Roland, will you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Greetings from Michigan. I'm Roland Zullo. Lately, what I've sort of focused my attention on in terms of research is kind of what are the institutional conditions that help make for a sustainable society, with sustainability being sort of broadly defined to include political stability, environmental stability and positive environmental conditions. And in this paper I'll talk about, it'll be about crime. Thank you. Do you want me to continue with my presentation or should I?
Yes, yes, please.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
just having everybody introduce themselves at the beginning of the presentation.
At the beginning of the presentation, all right. Well, here's what I'll do. Try to share screen here. Can you see?
We can only see the corner. Oh, that's better. Thank you.
Is that better?
Great.
Okay. So title of the paper is Non-Market Institutions and Crime in U.S. Economies. Basically, what I'm doing here is tracing back to a long time critique of the neoclassical idea expressed by Hayek, and then of course adopted by the Chicago School, which is that government is really more or less in the way. If you want a positive economy, you need to have small government. The kind of opposing view was Karl Polanyi, who instead generally argued that government can be a good function as long as you had a democratic society that pressured government to help dealing with the harsh effects of capitalism. So I treat crime as my measure of social peace. That's how I conceptualize it. And I look at two general categories of crime. There's property crime, which includes arson, motor vehicle theft, larceny, and burglary. And then violent crime, which is murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And so my general question here is, to what extent can economic structure explain crime after controlling for demographic factors and economic conditions? And let me just, so if you look at the structural factors I considered here, We have the amount of public employment, and this is what I conduct is a county level analysis. So it's an ecological study using panel data. So I look at the amount of public employment in the county, and then I break out public employment, the amount of police and courts, the amount of public education. I also look at private civic institutions like churches and labor unions. I also look at the level of diversity in the industry in the county, and then finally the amount of manufacturing that makes up the county. All of these figures are developed as FTEs of the total employment in the county. It's a big data set, 2001 to 2014. I use federal sources for this data. It's a regression analysis and so forth. Here are the findings. So looking at property crime and violent crime. So now all of these findings are expressed as a percentage change if there's one standard deviation increase in the structure factor. So a one standard deviation increase in the public sector equates with a 4.1% decline in property crime. That's how to read this table. Now, if it's in bold, it was significant at conventional levels. If it's not bold, then it's simply a point estimate. I didn't find very much with police and courts. And I talk a little bit about that in the paper. That could be because police and court includes workers in the prison industries, and often those are in prisons are often located in sparsely populated areas, so it may have confounded the findings. But the big surprise here was just how strong public education showed up as a factor in reducing crime. The larger the size of public education in the county, it had a significant effect on both property and violent crime, and you can see the percentages there. Not much in terms of civic organizations. The Herfindahl is a diversity measure. The higher the number, the less diverse. So what that is saying is that the more homogeneous the economy, the less crime. And then finally, manufacturing, which is what we expect from what we know about manufacturing jobs. They tend to be, manufacturing tends to provide gainful employment for people, and there's lower crime associated with more manufacturing. Now I also look at economic conditions. Again, same idea here. Increase in the poverty rate is shown to correlate with an increase in property and violent crime. That's not unsurprising. The unemployment rate is kind of interesting because you see a rise in property crime as unemployment goes up, but actually a decline in violent crime. And I'm not the first person to come up with that finding. And then median income. So where income is higher, counties with higher income tend to have more property crime. And then I look at income disparity, and greater disparity tends to correlate with more violent crime. Now, anticipating the questions that Gordon had for me, I also had another that used the same data. And what I'm showing you here are interaction effects between the various forms of crime and the densities of either Hispanics or African Americans in the county. And I wanted to, I included this in part to speak to the current protests that are happening now, and the questions about how we should allocate public money. Should we devote towards law enforcement or something else? And what these show here are interaction effects. And in general, what I found is that it appears as though counties that have large, significant minority populations are very sensitive, are more sensitive to the loss of public employment in the county. The negative effects show a decline in these crimes as public employment goes up in the county. So you can see it's a significant decline for murder, robbery, and so forth, and then also for vehicle theft in places that have larger levels of public employment. So it appears that areas where there are significant populations of minority citizens, that we need to protect public employment. Here's some conclusions. I won't go into those because I'm probably over my time, but both of the findings were published, and those are the sources. So the non-market institutions in crime was published in Review of Social Economy. I also have a paper in a book called Should More Law Enforcement Be the Answer to Crime? And that last table that I showed you was from that piece as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roland. And so thanks. And so next up, we have Liz Perlman to speak about the Bargaining for the Common Good campaigns. And please provide a brief introduction, Liz.
Hi, good morning. Just want to check, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. So good morning, my name is Liz Perlman. I'm the Executive Director for AFSCME Local 3299, and we represent about 27,000 low-wage service workers at the University of California system, and as well as several thousand patient care workers in the hospital system. And largely over 75% of our members are people of color, 40% are immigrants. They largely do, some of the hardest jobs at the UC. We, as a multiracial union and a kind of long history of fighting for, I would say, equality and kind of recognition inside the UC system, largely around basics like pay, benefits, healthcare, pension, stopping outsourcing. For us, that has been a long history of really seeing that our members' lives are essentially a social good. So when they benefit, the benefits to their community of, and you all know this well, the ripple effects, in particular because UC is in every city that they're in California, really anchor institutions. But I just want to lift up that I would say about probably the time of Michael Brown's killing and the uprisings in Ferguson, that our members and our leadership, our rank and file leadership, started to really, ask themselves the questions that, if the jobs that we fight for at UC are ones that we can be proud of, that pay a living wage, that have fully paid medical benefits, that have a pension, but that on the way to our jobs, we get stopped by police and we get killed and we never make it to our jobs, what good was the job? And, or we get detained at the border and our families aren't able to make it here. And I think that is probably the biggest central question driving our commitment to bargaining for a common good, is that our members are whole people. They're not just union members. They don't just show up to work for 8 hours a day. They go home to communities. And that every, pressure and lack of resource and lack of support that they experience in their communities is also a, reflection both of I would say the structure of the university and how hard it is for them to get recognition internally in the university system, but also a reflection of the society, and that they have to, you know, really link arms with the people who are doing the work in communities to fight for issues that affect them as well. And, you know, I would say that's kind of the crux of what bargaining for common good is about. And so, you know, we've taken that call of our membership and really put, you know, real work into recognizing, for instance, that immigrant workers at the UC shouldn't be treated differently and should have protections, and put those protections in our contracts. And I think now that we have, we just settled a 3-year contract fight, are really continuing that fight today, and taking movement for Black Lives as our fight, endorsing the platform. You know, we're organizing campaigns to defund the police, and I can, you know, kind of go into it more when we do our presentation, but I would say that probably the biggest frame, or the importance of seeing bargaining for the common good, is that it's, in some ways, it's really about the common good and less about bargaining. So even though we're not in a contract fight right now, you know, the campaign for racial justice and to end police brutality for our members is just beginning.
Okay, thank you, Liz. And then continuing the conversation on bargaining for the common good, next up, we are going to have Marilyn Sneiderman. And Marilyn, please provide a brief introduction of yourself, and then I will switch to the screen sharing for your presentation.
Thanks a lot. My name is Marilyn Sneiderman, and I'm the executive director of the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization, or more affectionately called CWO, a little bit faster. I could go at the School of anyway, at Rutgers. Let me just leave it that way. I come out of years and years in the labor movement. So our center really looks at where the labor movement's going, and we define labor really broadly in terms of including worker centers and other community organizations as well. So I guess what I want to do is first thank Liz for both her leadership and her remarks, but there's a movement happening. And if you want to picture the incredible work that 3299 of AFSCME is doing, and then put it on steroids and start seeing it all over the country, that's basically what bargaining for the common good is about. It's reimagining bargaining at this moment. There's 3 kind of conveners of this group, which is the center that I run at Rutgers, the Action Center on Race and the Economy, and then the Kalmanovitz Initiative at Georgetown for Labor in the Working Poor. And our work is really just to convene and support and share resources in all of this. So folks just wanted to know on the next slide, what is bargaining for the common good? And as I said, it really is about reimagining bargaining. But I do want to underscore what Liz said, that its focus is on the common good. It's not just what's happening at the table. It's really including stakeholders in what kinds of schools, what kind of universities, especially in the public sector, what kind of public services we have, and who's at the table, whose issues are part of that. So we talk about it as being a partnership around the long-term vision for structural change, and using bargaining as a way to move that forward. Next slide. And why do we do it? Is basically at this moment, it's about power. It's our best way to win. So we just have example after example of unions and community groups sharing, you know, we share common opposition. And so how do we link together to actually to take on those who are defunding the public sector and who are then profiting off of it? Why don't we just go to the next slide? Okay, that's better. And I just want to say, we may be the conveners, but the real work is happening around the country. And this is the group of our advisory committee. You'll see it's union leaders from across the country, as well as community leaders, to really share best practices, to strategize together, and to move things forward. We actually had Henry Garrido from AFSCME DC 37 in New York, who just joined the committee as well. But what you'll see is, I hope I can just lift up quickly, is Stacey Davis Gates from the Chicago Teachers. I think probably many of you watched the strike or hopefully participated if you're in the area. They actually centered housing and racial justice in the middle of their strike. And the mayor then said, why are you talking about housing? This is a bargaining, you know, we're bargaining with you. And they talked about there's 20,000 homeless students that we can count. There's probably many more in Chicago public schools, most of whom are brown and black, and that this has to be a central issue. And the LA teachers, you may see Alex Caputo-Pearl in this list, again, took on really major issues for everything from random backpack, you know, searches that again were targeting basically students of color, and got money for immigration support. I mean, lots of really creative work that's happening, and this is like, to me, the hope in the labor movement. And next slide. So our hope, these are the lessons that basically, I'm not going to take the time to go through them all, but people have really said, out of these bargaining for common good campaigns, what are the key themes? What are the principles that guide our work? And it isn't getting caught in a narrow, only looking at wages and benefits, but it really is going bolder and bigger at this time, going on offense and figuring out who really is profiting off of, especially in the public sector, defunding the public sector and then loaning the money back at exorbitant rates. A real engagement with community allies, centering racial justice in everything as a systemic, you know, part of all of our work. Using this campaign, as Liz was saying, about our members as whole human beings, right? So what we've seen is our own members get energized and engaged in a whole different way when we go bolder and broader, leveraging capital in our campaign and making sure that this doesn't stop once the contract settles. So just in closing on this, and there's lots more to say, we do hope you'll join us. The last slide, we could see. Oops, we lost the last slide.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's not showing up properly.
Okay, there is, if people are interested in knowing more, there's a bargainingforcommongood.org website that we have sample contract demands that we're collecting from across the country, from climate justice, racial justice, and everything that are coming from the field. And also we have lots of resources there. So anyway, whatever we can do to help, and hope you'll be engaged in building this and moving this work forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And so now this takes us to our discussion portion, and I'm going to turn it over to Gordon Lafer. And Gordon, please give a brief introduction of yourself.
Thanks. Gordon Lafer. I teach at the Labor Education Research Center at University of Oregon. And I guess seeing how much time we have, I'm gonna start by asking one question to each of the panelists and then see if there's time for more questions. And I wanted to start with Liz Perlman. And one of my questions is that universities have often been considered bad places to strike because of the economic impact of strikes. Like, you know, if you strike a car parts plant, then within a day or two, the company's losing millions of dollars. But because universities bank almost all of their revenue long before the beginning of the year, you don't cut off the cash flow in the same way. Your union has used strikes effectively, sometimes calling off the strike by winning a settlement, sometimes going through with the strikes. And I just wondered if you could talk some about how you think about, you know, under what conditions strikes are effective in higher education, particularly in the context of a bargaining for the common good strategy, where a strike is part of mobilizing allies' pressure on the employer.
Thank you, Gordon. This might actually be part of the session where I might want to go off the record, so I can answer a little bit more holistically. But
the first question I wanted to ask you is that some of the findings of your study are, two of them are one that in places where teachers have a union in non-collective bargaining states, that the dismissal of poor performing teachers, at least in their probationary period, is higher than in non-union states, and also that the quality of education measured by test scores is higher. Both of those run against the common narrative that teachers unions basically protect shitty, mediocre teachers. And I would wonder if you could say why you think, what you think accounts for the findings that you had.
Okay, thank you for the question, because that was one of the core question in my head when I was writing another paper, and that paper has been luckily published, so I can talk boldly about it. So the motivation of that is, when you raise the minimum wage, and people argue that there's going to be a higher level of unemployment. So typical economic theory will say higher wage will lead to excess supply of labor. And if you believe that, then we should think about higher wage that unions ask for teachers. Why would it lead to better job security? So I thought it was kind of strange that we're looking at things a little differently for teachers unions and their outcome. So that's why I wanted to test the hypothesis. And I found that the highly unionized districts fire more bad teachers. And that's when I realized there's going to be something going on here. And the economic intuition that might have been overlooked in the argument is that employers always respond to unions' request, especially for this kind of public good, public education. So if districts have to pay higher wages, they will have a strong motivation to dismiss bad teachers if they have to pay even greater pay when the teachers receive tenure. So during the probationary period, district will have to carefully evaluate teachers' performance, and they need to pay even higher salaries once those teachers receive tenure. They need to do this before before tenure. So if district responds to this kind of economic trade-off between teacher compensation and employment, and if that trade-off is strong, then unions may not be able to capture both higher wage and better the secure employment. And that's one of the key findings in my previous paper. And I wanted to see if that same finding continues in the states that do not allow collective bargaining. And it did. So I still found that the highly unionized district, even though the collective bargaining is not there, we still see the higher dismissal rate of bad teachers during the probationary period. And we also need to see whether there's any relationship between dismissal rate and tenure teachers, because district can probably let the young teacher or novice teachers go, but protecting tenure teachers. But I do not find that in my analysis. I do not find any relationship between teachers unions and tenure teacher dismissal. So the finding is pretty straightforward. The unionized teachers dismiss more bad teachers during the probationary period. And the previous paper that I've been talking about here, the title of the paper is actually Myths of Firing Bad Teachers of Teachers Union. So I call it a myth because that goes against the common belief that people have. I think that belief is misplaced.
And what about the impact on student performance measured by test scores?
Right. I think the test score is not the best measure for assessing education quality, but it is one of the tangible measure that has some sort of national measurement. So if I rely on that measure, test scores, both math and English, is highly significantly positively associated with the union strength. And one of the factors I try to dig on is whether unions will influence teacher quality. And because unions give you higher wage and improve working conditions, and teacher attrition is lower and the teacher dismissal rate is higher, all this stuff is pointing to the same direction, that average teacher quality will be higher in the highly unionized district. And I don't know why other papers out there using different data set, or sometimes even the same data set, does not find the same thing. And it's kind of puzzling to me. And so I've been I've been conducting a lot of studies about the same topic for several years now. And the one thing that I realize is that the union effects and in the union, the role of unions significantly varies depending on where they are. So if you're operating in the northeast state, northern eastern states, if you're operating in the certain states, the roles and their activities are very different. And if you don't use a national level data set, it could mean very different stuff. But if you use a national level data set, then you might be missing out the important policy implication within each state. So I think that we have to talk more about like a holistic view. If you focus on this environment, the unions are able to do this and this. And in that case, the impact is kind of like that. But if you talk about the union's role in their area, then the view might be a little different. So instead of having this single sentence that unions do this, unions do that, I realized that it's more complicated than that. And as I listened to other speakers talking about their research view, and I realized that, okay, collective bargaining is important because it can get the job done. But not everything the workers want is through wages and working conditions. We want our voice. If we have something to say, we want other people to listen to us. And unions can probably be a channel for that, and like a union voice. And that kind of voice mechanism is also important for teachers because many studies find that teachers do value their voice channel so importantly, and it's associated with a higher level of attrition. So when they feel like their voice is not heard, they don't have enough control in their classroom, they don't have enough influence in the school, they like to quit their job in an early period. So unions also help teachers to lay out their voice. And that should be associated with teachers' morale eventually, and then that will link to student performance in the end. So all this stuff the unions do, even if they're working in a different environment, I think it's coherently saying the same thing. Unions help.
Thank you. I think the research, speaking as somebody on the Board of Education here in Eugene, Oregon, I think the research could be very useful. Let me turn to Roland Zullo. Roland, I feel like it's hard to imagine a more timely moment to come out with your research that looks at the trade-off between investment in policing and investment in public services. Not only because of the protests, but because it seems like we may be entering a period, like in the next few months, both of increased economic hardship and of budget cuts in public service more or less across the country. So I guess, the obvious question is, if you're called to testify at a state legislature as the professor expert in this moment, and they say, all right, well, what should we do based on your research? What do you say?
I would say I need some research funding. Well, there's a lot we don't know, but what the findings are suggesting is that it's very important to maintain public services during this time. And it's, when you talk about, the allocation of public resources, just where they should go, it's not necessarily clear that if your goal is to deal with crime, that the best place to put it is in the police force. That it appears as though, in particular, education might be a better investment for those public dollars. All of this harkens back to an essay by Robert Merton, where he talked about the sources of crime, and he discussed how really there's two mechanisms. We create a society with expectations for people, but then if you don't have ladders that allow for sort of legal ways to reach those expectations, there's a frustration, and that leads to crime. And I think education, the finding on education fits that essay so neatly, because it suggests that through education you create these ladders so that people can succeed, and meet societal expectations, and because of that you have lower crime. So so if I were asked, I would say we need more study on this, but it certainly is clear. Well, it's suggestive from my findings that just piling more money into the police might not be the best public investment.
Great, thanks. Patrice, do I have time for another round of questions, or should we turn it over to questions that have come in through chat or email? You're muted still. Patrice, you're muted.
All right, so it looks like the questions that have come in through chat have been answered individually. So I do think we have time for another round of questions. And please, if anybody in the audience does have something that you'd like to ask of one of the presenters, post it in the chat box and we'll try to work it in.
Okay, so then let me go back to, I guess, to higher education. And this could be either for you, Marilyn, or Liz, which is thinking about bargaining for the common good in higher education. And I was thinking about what you mentioned, Liz, about both about students being on picket lines and about thinking about what is the story that a strike tells or that a campaign tells. And it seems to me in higher education, you could tell a story about the quality of what you're doing, the quality of the services, either the quality of education, or maybe in your case, the quality of medical services for that half of your bargaining unit. And that that leads to a certain strategy to mobilize, if it's education, students, parents, people who care about that, or the people who care about the hospital services. Or you could have a strategy that says, well, the story that this is about the quality of jobs provided by the biggest or one of the biggest employers in this local community. And that goes in different strategic directions and builds different alliances. And I know that everybody, not just unions, but everybody wants to say, well, of course we do it all. But the truth is, everybody's got limited resources. It takes a lot to make it work in either direction. So I guess my question is, how do you think about, at the beginning stage, you're planning a campaign, and maybe it's different on different campuses. If you can talk about this, Marilyn, how do you think about which one of those directions you're going to emphasize and what is going to be the story and the concentration of resources in a given campaign?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think probably for us as, service workers or patient care workers, it's easier that the latter one is generally speaking kind of how we approached it. But I think that probably the run through and even where I've seen, for instance, like grad student campaigns or faculty campaigns, at the end of the day, it's still about my wages and benefits equals your quality education, I haven't really seen the level of campaigning for the common good campaigns yet in higher education. I think there's a lot of affiliates around the country that are really trying to take a look at this question. But my sense is that the biggest kind of run through is not just about quality, but is around access and who's making the money off of it, and student debt and tuition and how much it costs and who's in and who's out. I think a lot of people, somebody gets an acceptance letter this month to the UC Berkeley, like they're not going to be like, well, the quality isn't as good as it was 10 years ago. So, it's like they're going to go to Berkeley. Same thing with UCSF. Like your kid is dying of cancer, you're going to go to UCSF. It's the number one medical center in the, so we, but it's more about probably the strongest elements of our campaigns and the things that we've been pushing for is about what is the role of the university, period, right, in society. Is it about making sure that Felicity's Huffman's kid can get in, or is it about making sure that, the folks that like the economic ladders that that Roland was talking about really are real, two people really have access. Like, can our members conceive of their kids going to a UC, and both the quality of their own, their public education that they're experiencing, their own levels of poverty, et cetera, are barriers, but they don't imagine it because they don't think they can afford it. And so even though, for instance, at UC, they probably could, because there would be a full financial aid package because they make less than $85,000 a year, but still, I think that a lot of this is about the kind of reimagining of it. And then I would say really especially for bargaining for common good campaigns around higher education, that increasingly it's really about centering race and equity in the things that we're fighting for. And also really looking at that, how has essentially higher education basically become like the Canary Islands for a lot of Wall Street profiteers. They're hiding a lot of money there. They're not paying their fair share of taxes that could actually make higher education free, because they're donating money. Or they're on the other side, they're the investors that are taking, essentially our members' pension fund money and investing it in things that are driving, inequality in our members' communities. So I think it's really kind of looking at the wolf in the hen house, so to speak, that a lot of folks who make the university good aren't really making decisions, I think most of the people who make financial decisions at the UC are, used to run public finance at JP Morgan. Now they're in charge of finance at the UC, and they'll probably go back to becoming, VP at JP Morgan after they're done at UC. So I think these are the kind of core questions about what should be on the table that preserving quality don't really get to.
Thank you. And Marilyn, do you want to add anything about, oh, I'm sorry, Patrice.
Oh, yeah. So also, Marilyn, there was a question in the chat box about the hospital's safety and bargaining for common good. So in your piece, can you touch on that too?
Yeah, so I'll just briefly say yes to Liz on everything she was describing, but what I find hopeful again about the moment we're in is that higher ed, like unions across the country are in higher ed, are all talking to each other. It doesn't matter if it's CWA or UAW or SEIU or NEA or AFT. We keep having these calls about, like basically who's defunding your universe. Like you start looking at boards of directors and trustees, and you start looking at who's involved in trying to suck money out of higher ed all over the country, and start coordinating about what kinds of campaigns do we have to run, and what are the lessons we're learning. And so we've had quite a few gatherings now of folks across unions, and it's actually really great. And people are sharing ideas and all of that. And I do want to lift up, we're talking much more right now about both higher ed and public sector itself. This strategy is also growing in the private sector as well, which is, again, hopeful. You look just at bank workers even, and anyway, I can go on and on about it, but in healthcare itself, and especially when you look at the timeliness of it now, that there's several unions that are also with community partners and family members and, patients, everyone who's looking at funding for safety needs in hospitals. And it's got to be a collaborative and strategic and bold bargaining right now, especially given everything going on.
Thank you. Eunice, Han, if I can, this is kind of unfair because it's not really your research, but as somebody who has looked at teachers' unions in non-collective bargaining states, I did want to ask you some about the strikes we saw in strikes and activism in West Virginia and Arizona and North Carolina. And, a lot of people ask, like, well, why are we seeing this upsurge of teacher activities specifically in non-union, in states where there isn't collective bargaining? And, some of the things that I've read, part of this, well, there's states with extremely low salaries, and so teachers were really at a desperate point. But some of it has also been that, like, without collective bargaining, the whole state kind of essentially becomes one bargaining unit whose boss is the legislature or the governor, so it lends itself to statewide mobilization. And even that, you know, things that we struggle in the labor movement where we're trying to mobilize people, but there's also something sluggish and bureaucratic about unions, and sometimes there's an organic moment of mobilization that happens outside the labor movement, but that's then not sustainable because there's not institutions. I just wondered, as somebody who's looked at this, what thoughts you have about, you know, what the facts of not having a legal right to collective bargaining have done to shape those struggles that we've seen in those states over the last couple of years?
This difficult question. I think the one thing I can say about the entire state being in one unit, there's a reason why local bargaining unit has been set in the past the way it is now, because, well, it's harder to represent people from various backgrounds and with a variety of interests. So the cost of unionization is going to be higher if the members are from diverse backgrounds. So if you're trying to make the entire state as one unit, and we will probably expect to see a greater variance among teachers in terms of what their preferences towards work and environment, in terms of what they want to get out of from this negotiation process. So we will have to define who the typical worker in the negotiation process will be if the entire state is one unit. And then the terms and conditions that's been negotiated through that process, it's going to be somewhat different for each teacher. So they might be very unhappy about what they're getting out of it. And I don't want to say, well, it's not necessarily off the record, but I don't want to sound like I don't trust the public good, but it's just, when it comes to union activities, the employer resistance is expected. No employer, I don't want to say no. Okay, a lot of employers do not like unionization, we know. And for public school teachers, the employer is the government. And for public education, the government is the single employer in a sense that they are becoming like a monopsony. So school district actually has a huge power over teachers' lives, whether we like it or not. And in that case, they already have a huge power over teachers' lives. And then if they have to come up with a negotiation process, and we're gonna end up putting too much power on state's hand. And I don't know if the quality of their service as the bargaining unit or negotiation unit is going to be any better. And what if we actually kill up all the private sector unions and we only have state left to bargain for teachers? And in that case, we're gonna think about worse outcome for union members than before. So I'm not sure if I answered your questions correctly or to the extent that you would like, but yeah, that's probably what my take out from the entire story, that the state is becoming one unit, and maybe they're trying to provide they're trying to replace the union services, something like that.
Thank you. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who knows the exact answer to that question. So, but I think, you know, as somebody who's looked at it. The question I wanted to ask you, Roland Zullo, is one of the things I was intrigued by in your research was, you know, you raised the question of when there's an investment in public services and you see a positive impact, is it because of the services or is it just because more people are employed, particularly in low-income neighborhoods? And one of the things that you found is that when the same public services were privatized, the impact was not as great, even though the jobs, you know, presumably have the same number of people employed. And so I wondered if you could say something about the impact that you found, not from defunding public services, but from privatizing.
Yeah, that's a good observation. And in the paper, I talk a little bit about that. Is this a good job effect from the public sector, or is it from the service itself? And it's probably a combination of both. If you note the finding on manufacturing, that's private manufacturing, which shows more manufacturing equates with less crime. That's probably a good job effect. Same token though, there is something unique about the public sector in that the public sector has a mandate on it to essentially provide a service to the whole community. They have a mandate toward inclusion that doesn't exist in the private sector. So you privatize a service, and you know this because we both studied privatization quite a bit. You see things like sorting and exclusion that begins to happen as the private vendors pick and choose the clients they want to work with or the services that they want to provide, which ends up cutting out and leaving out typically vulnerable people within the community. So, the more general benefit of having a service public is that there's pressure to be inclusive, and that, of course, comes through the our democratic institutions that apply pressure on schools and services and so forth to make sure that children of all abilities and so forth are well served by the service.
Thank you. And just, to set the record straight, Roland, you said you and I had both studied privatization. I think you know that most of my study was stealing and reproducing your methodology. So I want to give credit where credit is due on that. Patrice, I have more questions, but maybe I can shut up and give it over to Chad, or if panelists have.
Well, we are actually out of time now, so we're 1 minute over. So I wanted to just close by thanking everyone for a great session. Thanks to our panelists for sharing their research and experience. Thanks to you, Gordon, for leading the discussion. And thanks to all of our attendees for joining us for this conversation.